Surf's up. Good evening, I'm Kostas Argyros. Welcome to all those who are in the room today, and welcome to those who are joining us on the internet through the live streaming. This is day 2 of the conference that, as you can see, is entitled For a New Left Progressive Pillar, a Europe for the Many. I'm Kostas Argyros. I'm both happy and honored to host and coordinate this panel on safety, the left, of course, safety and social state. Mrs. Konstadina Kouneva, MEP, you all know her, she's MEP with Syriza, and she's a candidate again for the 26th of May elections. And Mr. Douzinas, he's also very well known, he's an MP for the constituency of Piraeus, and he is member of the Permanent Committee of Defence of the House. Unfortunately, Mrs. Effie Achtsioglou, the Minister for Labour, who was scheduled to join us today, was the unfortunate victim of a flu. Her voice is gone, so she can't join us. Now, we will try to raise and touch all the issues that are particularly hot and sexy. We have to do with safety and security. This is the framework for Syriza in these European elections. Now, before I give the floor, first of all, to Mrs. Kouneva, ladies first, and Mr. Douzinas, I would like to say that security is of a particular importance because, well, especially at this time, the conservative powers have used it as a spear point of their propaganda. Now, when they're talking about security, these right-wing people talk about border safety, border safeguarding, and they are promoting specific policies within that framework. And these are policies that are on the flip side of what the left wants. When the left is talking about security, we're talking about social security, labor security, and some issues that are rather neglected, I'd say, in our country, like security and safety of private information and personal information at a time where people become increasingly transparent. And this is an issue that I'm afraid we haven't touched upon in Greece a lot. We're talking about internet security and security in this, well, electronic age that we're living in, and it's a very good opportunity to see how the left can try or manage not to allow the neoliberal and right-wing parties to monopolize this sense of security, but also to put its own issues on the table, but that are equally important. I don't want to tire you any further. We will have the possibility, the chance rather, to talk later when we'll have the discussion. I'll give the floor to Mrs. Kouneva for her presentation, and then to Mr. Douzinas before a more open and free discussion. Dear friends, dear comrades, I think that the title of this discussion is a very smart one. It gives us the opportunity to retrace the line that separates the left from the right around a notion that for the past 2 decades has been shed light in a unilateral manner, and I'm talking about security. And in the name of security, our world has become even less secure. It became more scared, more suspicious, more tormented. After the attack on the Twin Towers in 2001, there was a huge turn all over the Western world in the name of security. There were bloody wars. Tremendous amounts were spent in arms and weapons and in policing the people. Legislations were passed that curtail and limit democratic rights and give huge powers to uncontrollable and unchecked mechanisms. What was developed was an ideological monopoly of security, on which a very dangerous meeting between neoliberalism and racism took place. The far right, the extreme right, included even neo-fascist views and opinions. Now, we must admit that we, as the left, did not react intelligently in this ideological monopoly of security. And this despite the fact that the everyday experiences and lives of the people we represent help us talk about the true source of security. Now, when does a person feel secure? It is when they have a decent and fairly remunerated job, when the terms of work and employment are straight and predictable, when they can plan ahead for the foreseeable future of themselves and their children, when they know that they enjoy social security while they're working, so that in their golden years they will enjoy a pension, when their children have access to a public educational system, and when they and their families have access to a proper public healthcare system. It's when they know that even in the off chance that they will become unemployed, there will be a satisfactory unemployment benefit. When they know that the little money they save at the bank or whatever will be there when they need it. They will know that their family will not be left without a roof over their heads because they can't afford the loan. When they know that they will not be discriminated against because they're a woman, a homosexual, a transsexual, a Muslim, an immigrant, or someone different. This sense of security of the people is built using simple things that go without saying. We as the left know that even these simple things are not guaranteed in a capitalist system, which is based on the exploitation, it's based on profit. And we also know that whenever we did succeed in enhancing the conquests to the benefit of the employees, things were always for the better. This happened for several decades after World War II all over Europe. The workers, the employees had a basic package of secured benefits. The neoliberalism and the austerity policies that they promoted in Europe demolished all social rights alongside with the sense of security. During the crisis from the year 2008 onwards, this became the rule. Workers' insecurity became the prerequisite for the financial security of the European Union and the Eurozone in particular. That was the dogma on the basis of which, in Greece and in other countries alike, these hard memoranda were imposed. Now, we know that this was a political fraud in which, apart from the conservative powers, those who also helped were those of social democracy. When they were in power, they promoted the policies of demolishing the social state, such as the reforms of the Schröder government in Germany 15 years ago. Luckily, today, the Social Democratic Party of Germany distances itself from this poor past, and we hope that this is a sincere turn for the better. And this gives me the opportunity to say that from my experience in the European Parliament, especially over the past 2 years, I've seen the chance for cooperation between the left and progressive powers around a program of social and labor security in Europe. around what is called social Europe. Now, I'll give you some examples that showcase the difficulties and the challenges. First of all, the European pillar of social rights. Great efforts were made for this text, which includes 20 main principles for the labor, social security and other social rights, to become a substantial and primarily binding text for the member states of the EU. Alliances were built around the proposals of the left, around the very idea for this pillar to have a power that is tantamount or equal to the Stability Pact. But this was met with resistance from the conservative parties in most member states, and so this pillar is nothing more than wishful thinking. Social indicators that are tantamount and of equal value to the economic ones. I personally, alongside our political team, tried to pass in various legislative documents our position to establish binding social indicators that will be valid alongside the financial ones when a member state is being audited. And we succeeded that in two documents, for the European semester and for employment in the Eurozone, for this to be both a position adopted by the European Parliament as a whole. But there is still a long way to go until such time as the Council accepts it as well. Third, pan-European pension product. Here we had an attempt on behalf of the Conservative powers and the Commission to take a step towards the privatization of social security, the so-called third pillar of social security, which was, promoted in the guise of propaganda by Mr. Mitsotakis in our country. Now, behind this product, we said that tremendous interests are hiding, like BlackRock, which actually introduced that. And they want to profiteer against social security, public social security. Despite the fact that there was very good cooperation with the socialists and the Greens, the right, by that I mean the Liberals and the Conservatives, managed to get a majority vote. Point number 4, European Accessibility Act. Now, this is a very important piece of legislation that was voted a few days ago and pertains to 80 million European Union citizens with disability. Thousands of services and products need to be adapted to the special needs of the handicapped and therefore be accessible. Tremendous consultations were made with the disabled persons associations. We proposed several amendments on the rights of the disabled people. Now, in the committee that we actually moved this forward, we had very good cooperation with the Socialists and the Greens. But here we had another rather sad phenomenon. In Europe, in the External Market Committee, that was the main committee responsible for this initiative, MEPs, in the name of the cost for businesses, weakened the proposed directive by rejecting most of our proposals, including the most basic one, which is to include in the European Accessibility Act the structured environment. Now, to put it in simple words, in order for a bank ATM to be truly accessible, The environment needs to be accessible for a person who is blind or has a motor disability. Now, this provision, although it may seem as self-sustained, was not accepted in the name of the market. Sixth, the Act for Care Personnel. Now, personally, I'm very happy for this text, which was actually adopted as a position by the European Parliament and recognizes labour and social rights for approximately 2.5 million domestic workers, in the majority women. But in their majority, these groups, the rights, both the conservative and the liberal one, and extreme far rights, voted against this report and abstained from the voting as a whole. At this point, I should say that when the voting started regarding this report, they just stood up and left and came back into the room for the next voting, because they considered that if they voted against it, they would expose themselves for what they really are. And so they didn't want any legislative measures that would make the more invisible employees visible. They even voted against provisions regarding the protection of immigrant workers who have been mistreated by their employers. Here one can say that racist and anti-labor views and opinions go hand in hand. Now, I don't want to tire you any further. I believe that these few examples suffice to indicate, to highlight what it really means for the left, labor and social security, and how, on the contrary, the right both works for and votes in favor of insecurity. We need to work, it's very important, to work on what is called the new social protocol, alongside the labor unions and the progressive teams and groups within the European Parliament. Not only to have just another proclamation of general principles, but in order to be able, through the next European Parliament, to introduce in the various texts more such commitments for social binding contracts, for the social security system, for the public healthcare system, in order to recreate, to re-establish with Syriza a true social state of welfare for everyone and for all member states. I should also like to add at this point that the Prespis agreement is a very good opportunity for the strengthening of security in our area through the creation of a Balkan development plan, which will bring about long-term security and much better growth prospects and peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Kouneva. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Douzinas, and I will speak afterwards. Thank you very much. I must say from the outset that it is a great honor for me to share this panel with Mrs. Kouneva. She has played an important part in the European Parliament when it comes to promoting the rights of many categories of the population, and I would like to wish her the best for the upcoming European elections. Given that Mrs. Kouneva and Mrs. Achtsioglou, if she were here, they would talk about labor and social security issues in the European Union. So I thought about focusing on the future of Europe, the welfare state, and social security in general. In 2017, the European Union celebrated its 16th birthday, and all leaders met in Rome, and they celebrated the fact that Europe has now reached its midlife, and it's now going through a midlife crisis, actually. And its 60th birthday were actually obscured, to keep using the family metaphor and remembering British comedy. They were obscured by a divorce, by the rise of a criminal child and a potential funeral. The divorce is clear. We're talking about the Brexit, whose results for both the British citizens and the Europeans and the Greeks in particular will be disastrous if we have a disorderly Brexit. Especially now, the criminal delinquent child is the rise of the far right, of racism, of Euroscepticism. And what happened yesterday in New Zealand, a country with which I have a personal relationship with, actually demonstrate an international era, a dark age. And given that New Zealand is a peaceful country, this was quite shocking. Today, however, I would like to talk about the third thing I mentioned, a potential funeral, a death, rather. And I'm referring to the idea which dominated in the last 30 years the political scene of Brussels and the European Union, the idea of political integration, of the path towards a federal European Union, the United States of Europe. It is clear, and it was clear in 2017, that through the coexistence of the different crises, that the European Union is now facing an existential crisis. All this led to a panicked rethinking, an effort to re-examine the European Union by the European elite, and trying to find a way to convince the European citizens who were criticizing the course of the European Union. I mentioned that last year in a conference held here in Greece. We are in a very difficult, a crucial moment, historical moment right now. These are moments in history where states are being refounded or are led to decay. And the left has been arguing that the European Union needs to be re-established. We need a different Europe, the Europe of the peoples. And now almost everyone agrees with us. We had the white paper of the Commission with the 5 alternatives for the future of Europe. Then we had the 6th alternative by Mr. Juncker. And now the initiative for these measures is in the hands of Mr. Macron. And right now there is also a series of significant proposals that started 2 years ago. And right now we are at the latest version by Mr. Piketty and his team. The left had mentioned and had talked about existential issues in the European Union from the outset, and in the upcoming European elections in a few months, the left will focus on the risk related to the rise of the far right and the risk of fascism for the entire Europe. So the left correctly put forward and prioritized in its agenda for its campaign the issue of eliminating the far right. However, the re-establishment of the European Union, which was initially our idea, has been left aside. And we are rather marginalized in the discussion about the European Union. If you look at the declaration of Syriza and the declaration of the European left for the European elections, of course, we will see that there are important proposals. However, until now, and despite being the first to mention the fact that we need another Europe, we haven't included in the center of this discussion an inclusive and integrated, comprehensive plan about how we can create new foundations for the European project. We haven't discussed in detail what I would call the reform architecture that we need. There is a window of opportunity. It's rather limited by the end of 2019. And I believe that this is the time for us to enter this discussion in a structured way, in an organized way. To do this, we must focus on how we came to this point, how we came to this crisis, its political and institutional expressions, and we must also start talking about where we want to go. I believe that the rise of the far right and fascism is just a symptom. The causes, the root causes, are deeper and date back since many decades ago, and not just 2 or 3 years when we have started focusing on them. Now let us talk about the past and about how we got to this point. Mrs. Kouneva mentioned in detail the initiatives of the European Parliament about the welfare state, so I would like to briefly mention the institutional framework. Since the 80s, and mainly from 1989, the continuous convergence of European societies became the raison d'être of Brussels. And there are two opposing models that were trying to impose themselves in this integration course. First of all, we had the model that wanted a continuous deepening and political unification towards a federal European Union, and we had the transnational model, a model of the single market and transnational market, whereby the powerful debate, the powerful states discuss and make all decisions, and of course there are some safeguards for smaller states. And the Eurozone crisis and the refugee crisis demonstrated that strong states are actually departing from the European direction of unification and integration in favor of transnational character. The instruments that they are using, such as the Eurogroup or the ESM, are actually beyond the European law. There is no law governing those instruments. Then we have the six-pack, two-pack. And I'm not talking about beers here. I'm not talking about beer bottles. I'm talking about measures. We have the summits that are very important, and all this has led to the weakening of political integration, and therefore powerful states are now making decisions. And the currency union, with the existence of creditors that impose a hard austerity and states that are borrowing, are taking loans, and that have no choice but to do so, this shows that the future of these policies will probably be the end of Europe as we know it. Very often this system hides behind European institutions and rhetorics using the pretext of federalism. If you go to meetings of the European Union, transnational meetings, you will hear people saying how good Europe is and the prosperity it has brought. However, if we enter more specific subjects, you will see that its state and its representatives promote their own national interests as they perceive them. The policies followed by the Eurozone have a federal perspective and are promoting integration. However, as we have witnessed here in Greece, they actually promote the imposition of dominant austerity opinions and aspects and the interests of the powerful states. It's what Plato called the medicine, that is convergence through austerity. It is a medicine that is a poison and an antidote. It is the same thing, it is the poison and the antidote to the poison at the same time. So here we must discuss our institutional proposals for the re-establishment, refounding of the European Union. What the crisis has taught us is that a crucial issue in reforms is to focus on the distribution of power and resources between states, peoples and institutions of the European Union. I told you that this is a decisive moment and that everything is open right now. As I said, there has been a series of proposals for the reconstruction of Europe, another Europe as we call it, the White Paper, the proposal, the Juncker proposal, that promotes the perspective of the European Union. He calls it a more united union. He proposes a president who will be the president of the Council and the Commission at the same time, a minister for finance with a slight increase of the budget, expansion of the Schengen and the euro to all member states, and aid from the European Commission to countries that are outside the Schengen and the Eurozone in order for them to have access to a fully integrated European Union. Of course, all this was forgotten. Last year, we were discussing about the 5 scenarios of the White Paper. Right now, we have stopped talking about them, and President Macron is now a pro-European and has taken the lead in respect of the answer by the European Union to the far right. There was also a personal dispute between Salvini and Macron when, for the first time in history, France asked its ambassador in Rome to come back because Macron was very frustrated by the fact that Salvini met with representatives of the Yellow Jackets. Macron has made a series of proposals here in Athens, in France as well, in Sorbonne, and in January he presented the full spectrum of his proposals for the future of Europe. So he proposes the creation of an assembly or a congress for Europe, and after holding a consultation in all EU member states, by the end of 2019, this Congress will meet, and according to Macron, there will be 12 proposals which will be completed through a dialogue, consultation with citizens, businesses, the scholars. And he argues that this dialogue and this European Congress could even result to an amendment of the treaties, a new treaty, probably. The French president proposes a series of new institutions, a European Council for Security and Migration Management, an organization for the protection of democracy, a Security Council for defense and security, European Bank, Environment Bank, financing of green energy, and a minimum social wage. He also proposes a new convention about security with a clause of mutual defense clause like the one used in NATO. So he proposes putting security and defense at the center of the European project and promoting the militarization of Europe through the creation of European troops and mutual support. And Germany rejected the majority of Macron's proposals. As the successor of Mrs. Merkel, Mrs. Kranenberger said, no European state can respond can cover this proposal because the European Union is actually a composition of nation states. The solution is not to remove powers from nation states. Centralism is a solution. The Europeanization of institutions, of course, would be an erroneous approach because Europe should be based on nation states because they actually provide the reason for the existence of the European Union. And this was also upheld by the European Court, which has said that the existence of member states, sovereign member states, is the basis of the existence of the European Union. So according to the opinion of Germany, the future is business as usual. So maintaining the status quo, maintaining a German Europe, a European Union where Germany remains the strongest state politically and financially, and despite giving some space to Mr. Macron for the existence of a new German-French coalition after the exit of the UK, Germany accepts only a few proposals made by Macron and France right now. According to the German view, we are and we will remain into a historic phase in the history of the European Union, which is characterized and will keep being characterized by divisions and fragmentation. We have seen that recently through the creation of different circles of influence, groups of states, which form a common opinion and are actually lobbying this in institutions. One example are the Visegrad countries or the Baltic countries. Right now we have the creation of the group led by the Netherlands and Germany, of course, who are actually promoting the interests of the hardcore of Europe, austerity, and continuing the social and economic policies that are in place right now. In the south, we also have a group of states of the south, but this is actually lagging behind and it will not play an important part in creating Europe with different groups of states which serve their own particular interests. If we do not focus on the minimum, if we look at the minimum proposals on which France and Germany agree, these are the following. First of all, the external policy, defense and security policy. And I have seen that because I attend many meetings, transnational meetings at the European level. Security and defense policy is a policy that actually replaces social security. So military and civil security is in opposition with social security. This is the first thing where we see that there is an agreement between the two states. They keep talking about the different military initiatives, military alliances, like PESCO, etc. And the second agreement is the common asylum policy. And their goal is not amending Dublin, which creates many problems for first entry countries, but rather to have an additional protection of Europe's external borders. So discussing financing mainly focuses on Frontex, increasing the budget of Frontex, adding officers to sea borders and land borders, and the creation of reception centers in Northern Africa. So moving the problem away from Europe and taking it to Africa, to big camps where the procedure, the asylum procedure, will take place. And the third thing they agree on is free trade. Right now, the European Union is trying to present itself in opposition with Trump. Right now, Trump supports protectionism. On the other hand, Europe supports free trade. And in this sense, it may become a global leader, a leader that, as opposed to Trump and the US, will support free trade, which up to now was at the hands of the US. Now let's talk about Greece. This business as usual situation and this agreement between the French and the Germans does not answer our existential question, which is why have European citizens been alienated from the European Union? Because in this context, in this framework of alienation and questioning of the European Union, why do we have the rise of far-right movements? The fundamental reason for this lack of solidarity is that the monetary union, as opposed to its promises, increased the gaps between national economies and therefore between the living standards of the people. So the anti-popular and far-right parties actually find fertile ground in the austerity policies and the failure of the integration policy that was based on convergence, and not only institutional convergence, but also convergence of social rights, convergence of the standard of living, and eliminating the differences between Athens, Berlin, and Paris in the eyes of the European citizens, whereas in reality they actually become bigger. The perception that the monetary union is not to the benefit of people, of the citizens, and it's no longer a win-win situation for the states and the people, and is to the benefit of a few. So the main dilemma of the European Union, and when we focus on the root causes and not the symptoms, is whether in the future there will be a supranational organization that guarantees the well-being of the people, or whether nation states will become again the main institutions of exercising power through circles of influence and different growth pace. So can we have a supranational democracy, or is the nation state the only environment for exercising democratic policy? This dilemma is expressed through the opposition between Macron and Salvini today. Macron is a pro-European, a supporter of the European idea, and we have the main proponent of populism, that is Salvini. Salvini and other far-right politicians in the European Union are based on a social environment that actually identifies and actually blames the European Union for all the problems of today's world, unemployment, the increase of inequalities, and therefore requesting a return to national interests, to complete sovereignty, and the national interests as defined by every government. So Salvini and other far-right politicians like Orban are saying that, okay, in the past 10 years you have been talking about integration, about convergence in the Eurozone mainly, but in reality the strong states were imposing their views. And what we want is to have our own space in order for our objections and our views to be heard. And to the extent that this does not appear to be possible within the European Union due to the high power of Germany and France, it can only happen by returning powers and resources to the nation states. On the other hand, all the important achievements of the left in the past 10 years have taken place within nation states and not in the European Union. In Greece, for example, we have Syriza. It's an indicative example of such a success. In Spain, in Portugal, even in the UK, despite the fact that the UK will exit European Union right now. But it was at a national level that the left managed to achieve some victories. So I argue that we are right now at a transition between the previous globalized neoliberal system, capitalistic system, and a new system which is not clear yet. It has not been fully developed yet, and this is why I'm talking about a transition. So the old is no longer dead, the new is not yet born, and in this anxiety, this insecurity of the people, we have the moment, the era of the monsters, of the far right. And I will conclude with what I mentioned earlier, that we are at a very crucial moment, a determining moment. I believe that the left must become part of this discussion for the future of Europe and not just make proposals, because proposals by themselves do not lead to a comprehensive plan about where Europe is heading to. We need to build a new model about continuous social growth and restore relationships with the citizens. In order to do this, I believe that we need a comprehensive program for a new Europe. This will include radical changes when it comes to social and economic policies. We have already mentioned many of these things, but we must also look at the institutional structure. We must focus on the architecture of the European Union as it is right now, as we have analyzed it. And through this analysis, we must move forward into a new plan. And I believe that this is a task that pertains to the left, and the Greek left has an increased responsibility because it is the only left that is in power. And it is the first time that is in power, and it is rather audacious. We did not know how the system works here and in Europe. We are a government, but we are not in power, as we used to say. But this also creates an increased responsibility about how we can actually take power and not only have the government. So the struggle for the heart of Europe will take place in three fronts. First of all, we have to change austerity measures to increase cohesion through the transfer of resources to poorer countries, mutualization of the debt, creating a real banking union, with the creation of specific guarantees for deposits. We need a democratic and social agenda, but we are in an era of fiscal limitations. When we talk about the welfare state, and when people say we should go back to the welfare state, and this is what we did with the constitutional reform and the amendment of the constitution led by Syriza, which was a plan for the many. The draft amendment we submitted was an amendment that would propose a better future for the many and not for the few, as opposed to the draft of New Democracy. However, we cannot keep saying that we should go back to the welfare state as we used to know it, in Europe mostly, and not so much in Greece, but as they used to know it in the UK, in France. So there is a strange divorce between capitalism and democracy, between market and social justice. Most countries had achieved a welfare state. However, we must rethink the concept of welfare state. We cannot go back to the welfare state as it was, but we must think of new initiatives in order to construct a welfare state for this new era. It is clear that we must transform the European Union into a social union that respects the rights of workers. And this is what Mrs. Kouneva is fighting for in the European Parliament. We need an institutional establishment and implementation of gender equality, job security, measures for addressing unemployment, and other measures. In order to achieve all that, we must strike a balance between the social and economic dimensions of the European integration, because until now, the European integration, the failed European integration, passed through economic fiscal policies. There were no central social policies. The social pillar remained in words, and no policies were put in place by the European Union. So we must do all that. But as I told you, this is a very complicated era, and we must think of new ways in order to promote the welfare state. We need a new social contract for everyone. But this appears to be quite difficult. So, how can this happen? And now I will talk about the proposal. We are bringing forward the proposal of Thomas Piketty and the Piketty Group. It emerged for the first time about 1.5 years ago. It was actually brought forward right after the Macron proposal. According to the Piketty proposal, there is great need to finance new investments, mainly in the field of social policy, where there has been a reduction of investments, or rather disinvestment. And we must have investments be at 4% of the GDP. So according to this proposal, 4 new taxes will be introduced on the profits of big businesses, big enterprises. The income of people that have over 200,000 euros in income every year, the owners of assets over 1 million euro, and tax on CO2 emissions. This proposal is based on the following. His book, The Capital in the 21st Century, which is one of the most important economic analysis books, with a detailed presentation of trends, economic trends in the 20th century, reaches a conclusion. We already knew it, but he demonstrates it with a detailed analysis of evidence. So when the percentage of profit is higher than the growth rate of the economy, then we have an increase in inequality. And this shows us why in the end of the 20th century, we are at a point where 1% of the global population has 50% of global wealth. And if this situation does not change, this gap, this inequality will continue, and we will reach a point where the political system, either within the state nation or in the European Union, will not be able to legitimize the continuity of this system. This is a very good proposal, and it shows that the most important element in the increase of the gap between the poor and the rich is not income, but wealth, assets. So assets are very important and must be taxed in order to try and recover and close the gap. This is one proposal. I believe that something must be added to this proposal. That is, a series of initiatives that must emerge from the left, not only the center left, but the left in general. They are related to how a series of social services, of fragments of what we used to call the welfare state, how they can pass gradually from the public sector to the civil society. So through the refugee crisis, we've seen how people on the islands managed to give answers to the crisis and create dignified conditions for the refugees through their own initiatives and with no participation by the state, because the state was not prepared. I believe that this experience, and I actually experienced this in Piraeus, the port of Piraeus, where we had 500,000 people, refugees passing from the port, and we did not have any unfortunate incidents. We had no deaths, and this was an achievement by volunteers in Piraeus. They actually took the streets. They created structures, they created support structures for refugees, and this is something that we must study. We must see similar initiatives in other states, in the US or in Spain. And we must look at how this gradual change in our organization, in our structure, in our society and in our political sphere, how can we transfer capital and power? How can we transfer capital to the workers and competences from the state to the civil society? You will ask, how is this possible? We have said there's a big problem that Germany and France have agreed, and they are two teams that have, each of one has 11 players, but always Germany is the one that wins. Well, lately this is not the case, thankfully. So I believe that the comment is off microphone. Okay, Manchester United and Liverpool, well, this is not England. The majority of players are not from the UK. So, now let's talk about the political level. How can we move towards this direction? I would say that we need an important improvement and upgrading of accountability and democracy. We must do this at the political level in order to prevent antisocial ideologies. So we must create a European space of dialogue and action. This will start from nation states. And the proposal of Macron is very helpful in that regard. As I told you, Macron argues that by the end of 2019, we must have a big consultation in all European member states, all citizens, and then we will have a big European Congress when we will discuss a new European architecture. However, the left is no longer there. It should have been part of this discussion from the outset, and we were the first ones to say that Europe does not function. And at some point, Juncker realized that he had to adopt a white paper because he was losing the trust of citizens. So we are no longer involved in this discussion, and we need two things. First of all, to become part of the discussion. And there's a distinction between what we do in terms of creating a progressive front at the European Parliament in Greece, and there the issue has to do with our defense, with how we can support the welfare state and how we can actually prevent the attack of the far right. And there is another approach that's purely leftist. And of course, they are not two opposing things, but in the second approach, the left would focus on more general ideas in order to cultivate them and potentially adopt them, and then to include them in the broader dialogue. And here there is another proposal by Piketty, who says the following. Piketty says that without a new large-scale tax policy, it's not possible to improve the situation in Europe in research, social rights, the integration of refugees and migrants. So, through new taxation, under the US logic of no taxation without representation, he argues that there is need to create a second European Parliament or a European parliamentary body or a parliamentary assembly which up to 80% of MPs must consist of MPs from national parliaments, and only 20% must come from the European Parliament. So he recognizes that politics is taking place mainly within nation states, and this rationale of restructuring the European Union through a new taxation on on big assets and on the wealth must take place through a parliament that will be legitimized by societies. And this is why we will have representatives of the civil society, of the movements, of the civil movements, and this parliament will be responsible for this. It is a very good proposal. We must discuss this. Many of you do not know this proposal. And given that we have the upcoming European elections, we must take this into account in order to avoid the rise of the far right. We haven't discussed this because many of us may oppose, and we must give new ideas, but we need ideas in general. And right now, apart from listing the small but significant changes we propose, well, in order to adopt these changes, we need a political foundation. And I would like to conclude here by saying that all big ideas in modernity, for example, the state, the nation, nationalism, which was behind the creation of big states like Germany or Italy, who were created in the 19th century. Socialism also emerging in the 19th century and becoming one of the dominant ideological and political forces in the 20th century. Human rights. All this started as ideas, as theories, philosophical views, and at some point they became forces able to inspire people and change history. I'm afraid, and you might disagree, but I'm afraid that Europe did not achieve this. Right now, and I'm talking about my generation and younger generations, and I hope that the youngest generations are different. Of course, unemployed young people here in poor neighborhoods of Athens or in Tottenham, in London, or in banlieue, the suburbs of Paris, do not think and conceive themselves as Europeans. And I'm talking as a member of the left. I believe that we must recognize that this is the case. We must see the situation for what it is. And I hope for younger generations it will be better. We must see things as they are and think seriously. And this should be part of a consultation that we could have both at the level of Macron and at the international level, or internally within the left, in order to produce our own ideas. We must revisit the allocation of competences and resources between the central administration, the Central European Union, the states, and even more the regions and the municipalities. So, to the extent that right now we are in this transitional stage, I would say that the left should recognize the problem, a problem that has as its symptom the rise of the far right, and we must see how we can use political processes and proposals for addressing the problems. We must look at how we can create a view about a new, a different Europe. Right now, we do not have this. We agree in that austerity must change, the welfare state must be promoted. Yes, I believe that we have advanced. Unfortunately, all this has changed the social layers, the layers of society, and we must think about where we're going. I'm not saying that I'm completely right, but these are issues that must be discussed. And I will conclude now by saying that after all this theoretical discussion, our obligation for the next period is to struggle for the victory of the left in the European elections, to help Mrs. Kouneva be part of the European Parliament and win with Syriza, and to work very hard for the victory of the left and to put an end to this cancer that we call nationalism and far right. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Mr. Douzinas. After this very detailed analysis of Mrs. Kouneva for social issues of Syriza, I think that Mr. Douzinas raised a great number of issues that are of concern to me as well, and that I am afraid that we will not be able to discuss them on the TV panels before the European elections, at least most of them, and I don't know whether the left will also be responsible for that, Mr. Trigazis. Now, since Mrs. Achtsioglou is not present, I have prepared a 2-hour presentation for your benefit. Now, some of the things that Mr. Douzinas said, I had the opportunity to live from very close. I would like to summarize and add a few points that I believe are of interest before we open the discussion. Now, Piketty's proposal are very interesting indeed, and I will ask Mr. Douzinas if he can help me. It would be very useful for me to interview Piketty, and if he can do it, I'd be grateful to him. But we're talking about the end of austerity, taxation of the wealth. I would like us to see a bit the issue of this tremendous ideological attack that is waging as of late in relation to the social state. I imagine that many of you have seen this wonderful film, Daniel Blaine, and I think it's a great book that maybe Mr. Douzinas knows it. It's a book called The New Poverty that talks about how the social services in Britain have as a goal not to offer social service per se, but to cut benefits and social services immediately. Now, this is something that's happened under Schroeder, that Mr. Douzinas said, and the SPD says that many of the things that we adopted were against the very dignity of the people. Benefits were slashed at the smallest possible, for the smallest possible reason, and I believe that this tremendous attack that we hear about here as well, that it's the fault of the poor, that the unemployed are lazy, and that those who do not have it good or do not have a good time in these societies, they're to blame. I believe that this counterattack and this situation with this slashing of social benefits is in the back of our heads, and this is something that the left needs to see and needs to deal with. And now, I've seen people who are embarrassed to say that they're employed because they feel it's their fault. And these are issues that should be tackled by the left. Such issues explain why in many of those movements in Europe, because there are movements in Europe, and I was in France, I believe that the left there was caught unaware by the yellow jackets. This is the one issue I wanted to raise. Also, I believe that for the left, and Mr. Douzinas mentioned it, it's very important to decide what sort of institutions it wants in Europe and what sort of institutional changes we need to have in Europe. Syriza became the government and had this tendency to change everything. It had to compromise with all of these things, but I don't believe that the luck and the future of each country can be determined by a secret report drafted by some people. It reaches Draghi's office and Draghi decides to turn off liquidity for Greece. Or the fortune and luck and future of Greece cannot be decided when Tsipras has the gun of Merkel and the rest in his temple, and he needs to decide in a matter of minutes what to do. What has been established is unofficial, non-institutional ways of functioning in the EU, which we as the left have accepted them. And I believe that this is an issue to be raised by the left. I see many a time that in discussions we as the left in Syriza might not know that Eurogroup is an unofficial body. It is not an institution. We might not know the difference between the Commission and the Council. And I believe that a great struggle to be fought in the future is whether we will have a Europe that will be governed and ruled by the Commission, and if we want an actual Commission that would be working differently, it will be still keeping in operation this French-German axis unofficially, and any Schäuble or their successors will be deciding in the Eurogroup and the rest will be just ratifying it. So it's very important to see, because I believe that Macron's proposals that Mr. Douzinas mentioned are in fact innovative. And as I happened to be in Germany when this proposal by Kranbauer actually was made, I think that the only thing that we'll agree in is the issues of security and guarding and fencing in the borders. And in the discussions between Macron and Merkel, for the first time they spoke about industrial policy with an aim to build some colossal industries. Something which is, of course, against neoliberalism, but it shows how they think when it's for their own personal best. They think in a protective manner, in a statist manner, in a nationalist manner. And what the German finance minister is trying to do is to create a German super bank and to save Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank from their problems, shows exactly how this Europe is going to operate in the future. Now, well, with Macron, my problem is that on the one hand, he raises and proposes some innovative things, but on the other hand, the dialogue he set up in France as the national dialogue is, in my opinion, 100% a fixed match. What Maria the Naxar wrote yesterday, that 60% are still supporting the Yellow Jackets and only 28% is right. On the other hand, Mr. Macron is exercising a very harsh and very difficult right-hand policy. Now, the immigration problem, which is a problem here, issue as well, said that we don't want anything to do with that and we need to guard our borders. And I believe that this is something that will just deflate itself. Macron, I mean. And we can see past and move beyond his opinions. I don't want to blab a lot, but I wanted to ask Mr. Douzinas something. Because he said this Europe for the many is something that was proposed by Corbyn first, wasn't it? Well, 99%, I think it was to occupy, it was something that Sanders said as well in the United States. Now, I wonder if the decision of Great Britain at a time when Corbyn might be capable of coming to power, this potential Brexit might actually hurt the European left. I mean, if a strong Labour Party and a Britain that is active within Europe could actually help us, as well as the Greek left, the European left, to succeed, to make something better happen. Now, I have got pages of notes and I wouldn't want to monopolize the discussion. I want to open the floor for everyone who might want to share their opinions and ideas, but I will say this again. Looking at this Swedish girl that has been rising and raising all these children and seeing initiatives like the very romantic and abstract pulse of Europe in favor of a Europeanism that started from Germany, seeing the Yellow Jackets and seeing and observing such initiatives of movement type in Europe that show that the people are looking for new ways of expression and new ways of struggle or protest, I don't know exactly how to put it. These are things that need to be visited by the left. And some well-established May 1st things, or some bank holidays, or some protests that we in the public television have been doing for years, is something that needs to be revisited. And even after the European elections, because life does not end on the European elections. And I don't know who wants to speak Mr. Douzinas, now I had a contradiction with Venizelos in Delphi, and this whole thing started when I said that, well, imagine there is a strike of bankers and stockbrokers, and imagine a strike of the cleaners, the cleaning ladies, the people who gather the garbage or whatever, or the firefighters. Which one will bring a city to a halt? Imagine. But you here, because they're in Delphi, it was the elite, it was the crème de la crème. You may say that you have the power and you have the money because you base your profit on the work of the cleaners, of the nurses, of the teachers who are on 700 euros per month salary, and you believe that they're your inferiors. You are the ones who have benefits. These are not benefits because everything that this government did was benefits and charity and gifts. You have the charities, and this is an important thing to raise, that in reality, what happened, this social state, was a bit of an inverse thing. Those who received the benefits were exactly the rich and the elite, rather than the people of the lower social strata, who work honestly and get 600 euros for it. I apologize, I just want to add that. Right, so we have the so-called bullshit jobs, advisors to advisors, and so on and so forth. I would like to mention an example of that Mr. Douzinas mentioned. In the United States, about 15 years ago, there was a nationwide strike of all the cleaners. It was a strike that was being prepared for 2 years, but actually happened for a single day, and their proposal was to kick out a multinational company and not to allow it to undertake projects anywhere in the United States. This one-day strike brought about such a commotion in the States that their parliament decided that this company would no longer have the right to claim projects, and they're no longer doing business there. This is the power that such a strike has. It was a single-day strike, and it was just the cleaners sector. Right, so we have there, let's wait for the wireless microphone, because we need to have the interpreters to be able to listen. Isn't there a wireless microphone? Please wait for it. Now, you see, we're being watched over the internet, so we need to have a wireless microphone. Here, it's the gentleman in the second row. Now, two ascertainments, one question and one proposal. Now, the two ascertainments, it's well known that the Piketty team proposal has not been widely communicated. Therefore, this is the first thing I would like to state. Second, we as the left, at the level of the European Union, have not taken a stance. We don't have a position vis-à-vis this document. Here's my proposal. I would suggest that in view of the European Parliament's, you, Kostas, at the Athens Megaron, the music hall, had invited Piketty. He made a wonderful presentation, so we could probably ask him to come again and present either a theory in the Megaron or the Bouladzas Foundation, to bring him and actually present this proposal. Some of his proposals are very good, some others are very optimistic. There's no point in analyzing it here. Now, since you mentioned it, Kostas, as regards the issue of a creation of a so-called Senate, in inverted commas, at the European level, with the participation of members from the national parliaments and MEPs, isn't that slightly dangerous in the present time conjecture? I mean, we see a dangerous rise of the extreme left. Suppose, and this is a very optimistic scenario, wouldn't such a thing be dangerous, that we might have a Senate belonging to the far right, the extreme right? Right, now the lady asked for the floor first. Right, thank you. Now, unfortunately, I was unable to attend this session when Mrs. Kouneva was speaking. It was only Ms. Douzinas I heard. So I would like to pick up from where Mr. Argyros left off and his comment. I believe that as the left, we can, with relative security, if not with absolute security, consider that the plans of absolutely systemic powers and leaders they represent vis-à-vis the architecture of Europe is a fixed dialogue. Now, on that, I don't believe that the left is obliged to participate with a corpus of positions, because in a sense, for the wider society that's watching what's happening, it could legitimize precisely this level of dialogue. So I am absolutely not saying that we must have a level of that we must not have a level of important, deep and significant dialogue, but I don't believe that this is the scheme that can actually help the left narrative. Now, drawing from the remark of the previous comrade who spoke, I'd like to say this. The idea of a European architecture, which we more or less, even a wide left-wing spectrum considers as a given, this means that we're trying to find a remedy, without, however, touching upon the very depth and the foundations of this architecture. Now, this, in my opinion, might create a complexity that will alienate and distance society even further from the idea of a radical European architecture. I mean that to accept as irreversible the situation within the European Parliament or the Commission or the other non-elected institutions, and to consider that an additional institution might be able to remedy part of that, like the Piketty proposal on a Senate, sends a message to the European societies, the hoi polloi, as we say, that might not actually want to participate and get involved institutionally with all this labyrinthine architectural depiction of the European integration as a structure, with the creation of yet another institution of the hoi oligoi. And another point I wanted to make that has to do with current affairs, is that I believe that we as the left and as the European institutions, we still have another deficit that we're facing. This is the part that, in my opinion, is being wronged when we mention it as the ecology movement. I think that this is unfair to them. The fact that the left traditionally has been expending much of its time for political deliberation and consultation to refer to policies without touching upon the issues that pertain to the planet, with all their extensions and strands, and this is considered a bit of elitist or trendy or something that's for the younger people, this is another deficit for the left. An equal deficit is to go to an election struggle and to consider these transatlantic and other corporate agreements as secondary, and those that are masked under the so-called bilateral agreements. And there, our only aim of all left-wing powers all over Europe is to safeguard the names of origin of various products or various professional sectors, safeguard their perfectly legitimate professional rights. But we are missing the bigger picture. And I believe that this will make us face a much more adverse situation in the future. Thank you very much. Now Mr. Trigazis has asked for the microphone. Dear Mr. Argyros, dear Kostas, Comrade Kostas, these two papers were very illuminating. I would like to hear another one on national and international security, on the common security of all people and all states. That common security which is not safeguarded and consolidated through military means, through disarmament, both nuclear and strategic. And to talk about my, pain, because we all carry our own pain. I believe, to pick up from where I left off, that in order to be able to hail the European Union is to underline its Greek achievements. It's the most advanced area in the world in ecology protection. It's the European Union that denounced Trump's policy. We should underline some of the positive points of European Union. Ecological protection, it's unprecedented anywhere in the world. And I don't just mean at the European level, I'm talking at the level of the national states. Now, I have a question, dear comrades, speakers. Why these 2 days that we've been talking about the future of Europe, we didn't talk about the relationship between European Union and Russia? As far as I know, Spinelli, when he was incarcerated by Mussolini, wrote a manifest on a free and united Europe without accepting the then Soviet Union, which was an ally of Great Britain and the United States against Hitler. Now, do you believe that there can be European security without Russia, let alone against it? This is my question. Thank you very much. Right, well, I would like to share my pain with you as well, comrades, and protest. Now, I have been a victim of racism from Africans. Back then in 2015, during the consultations, I was at a conference somewhere in Europe, and Africans who became Europeans, each in their country, were expressing the private interests of their countries in Europe, attacked me verbally. And he said, you in Greece are destroying Europe and the euro. And I'm saying this primarily to point out one of the issues of historical left that has to do with information. It's a very important thing. Everything that we mentioned, we know amongst ourselves, but we're preaching to the converted. Now, I would like to endorse all this and say that we need to look into information. We have a huge information deficit, comrades. Programs are beautiful. We shared it and we can tell one another everything. Mrs. Kouneva's work is brilliant. The left comrades are brilliant, but they're not as widespread among the Greek society as it should, because we have the mass media that we have. Imagine if we didn't have the Radio Red, the Radio Kokino, what would have happened? And I have to say that the left, by nature, needs to be international. And I must say that this struggle needs to be extended to Africa and to Asia, to all the peoples. The message of the left must be, like the issues of peace and security, universal. My safety must not mean an attack on the safety of the other. And now Europe is setting up a security that creates insecurity elsewhere. We need to expand these struggles so that altogether, following the proposal of the left that needs to be passed down to the society, we will be successful. Thank you very much. Let's circulate the microphone until such time. I must say that this problem of information that you mentioned is not just a Greek phenomenon, you see. Now, yesterday Cosmote had... There was a film called Shock and Awe. There was only one network that said this does not happen, and no one would listen to them. Okay. Hello, my name is Lambros Stavru. I'm from the coordinating committee of Zographou of Syriza. Now, an issue is that of vulnerability. Does not participate in culture. It does not participate in a way that they feel that Europe is interested in them. Only the social state, in terms of economic benefits, cannot safeguard such a possibility and capability so that this part of the population, which is constantly enlarging, is constantly widening, can participate in the Western world and what happens there. So in order for the left to progress, we need to strengthen this feeling, this sense of those people, of those social groups, so that apart from the financial issues, they are supported in terms of the cultural networks and how these people work and operate. So only in terms of economics we cannot reduce vulnerability. Now, thank you very much for your time. Now we have a couple of ladies, but let's wrap it up so that Mr. Douzinas might be able to answer. I see some of you are wearing your parkas and your jackets. Is it cold? Can we ask someone to change the air conditioning settings? It's a bit nippy here. Right, thank you very much for this conference that you have organized, and particularly for the presence of Comrade Kouneva, who's we truly love, and she is doing great work in the European Parliament. We wish that she is re-elected. I'm Anastasia Politi. I've lived in France for a number of years. I just returned to our country very recently, and I share the same experience with Mr. Douzinas of the European citizen, because, well, when I was living in France, I used to say that I'm Greek and I'm a European, and I meant it. Because Europe has managed to do a lot of things, especially in terms of rights, the free circulation and communication of people, and the ideal of peace, which started after World War II being built. However, please allow me, with I'm humbled to share with you some of my fears, because I do not claim to hold the absolute truth. There are some of my concerns and fears, and they have to do with the European unification and the course that Europe is in right now. Now, since I lived for the past 25 years in France, when I first went there, I did find a social state of welfare. Respect to the citizens, social services, meritocracy, access to public affairs. But over time, and primarily due to European directions, I would hear from time to time that we don't do this because the European directive says this or the norm says the other. And what happened there, the social welfare state that existed in France, little by little, of course, as a result of actions undertaken by French governments themselves, but with reference to the European framework, slowly these social policies were removed altogether, resulting in the situation that you see in France today, the Yellow Jackets movement. And I am a member there because I go 5 days per month in France, and I know this movement up close and personal, and it is not an extreme right or a far right one. It is highly progressive, and I do hope that they will do something, and we need to embrace it in the left here. But in France, they held the 2005 or 6 referendum concerning the European Constitution, and the French voted no. And, well, it didn't come in through the door, but it jumped in through the window with the Lisbon Treaty. Now, this, for the French society, is not something forgotten. What happened to us in the summer of 2015 happened to the French in a much milder manner, but this deficit of democracy, this totalitarianism of European institutions has been smacked across the face of the French people. And now I would like to come back to Mr. Macron and to France, who a week from last Wednesday was convicted, actually, by the High Commissioner of the United Nations for the Yellow Jackets and their treatment. We have over 12 people dead and hundreds wounded. And that today the Council of Europe condemned the use of violence by Macron, and this is not something that we are not discussing here. Can we only change things in theory? We must reunite ourselves with a movement. There are movements in Europe, and there is where the unification starts for the European left. And I would like to remind you about Mr. Macron, in whom I do not trust, that he's trying to equalize anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, thereby locking out any movement in favor of the rights of the Palestinian people. And this must not be left unanswered. This is what I wanted to say, and be well. One last question, very, very fast. Thank you very much, all three of you. Now, whenever I hear Comrade Douzinas, I learn things. I work for international relations, I'm a pharmacist, and I work in social solidarity structures. And what Comrade Douzinas helps me to do is to see things from a perspective that I never thought of actually seeing things from. And whenever I listen to Comrade Kouneva, is a way to listen to my little voice inside that rebels whenever we have the social insecurity that we have all over Europe, not just in our country with the memoranda and all these policies. Now, this social Europe, the Europe of the peoples, has failed. And this is the numbers that say it, okay? Those who don't want to hear it and call us sentimentalists do not want to see the truth. There is over 120 million people who live at the poverty threshold or beneath. This is Europe-wide. And for a citizen, a European citizen, or finds refuge in Europe to be able to feel secure, it must be the responsibility of the state, the responsibility of Europe and of the society to make it so. And we need to understand that in order to achieve growth, we need to have security. A person who feels secure, according to what Comrade Kouneva said and Comrade Douzinas in very simple words, needs some prerequisites, some conditions that, if they existed in the past, have disappeared now or have all but disappeared. It's the social state, it's the healthcare systems, it's family planning, education, and the list goes on. Now, for me, this is the raison d'être. It's my reason for being in the left, to be able to express a discourse that does not only reflect my own needs or desires, but it will reflect the need to improve the lives of my fellow citizens. So it is within this framework, it is very important to undertake initiatives and to cultivate trust, the trust of societies towards us, to become understandable, and through the movements, like Anastasia said, to be actually able to convince the people that this is the only way forward. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, we have another panel at 6:30, and we will discuss other matters there. So I will give the floor to the two speakers so that they may answer to your questions and comments, because we have to start with the next panel soon. The first question was about the Senate. The other one was about relationship with Russia. And there were many reservations expressed when it comes to the ideas of Mr. Macron. Who wants to start? I will be very brief. The proposal of Mr. Douzinas was very interesting about creating a structure within the European Union that may be more functional and democratic for everyone. We must discuss this and analyze this. Now, about the question of Mr. Trigazis and Russian security, well, we must dedicate time and preparation in order to discuss these issues. This cannot be part of this specific discussion. There is a proposal of Russia about discussing the ATA treaty. And a new treaty must be discussed, which will replace the existing treaty. And Russia has been put this on the table for discussion. And information is also very important. The information we get is not complete because there is no freedom of speech. The mass media are being controlled, and therefore we must find other ways in order to ensure the security and to ensure that people working in the media are safeguarded and have the intellectual rights for the work that they produce, ensure their intellectual rights, and avoid attacks. And people in this way will be able to judge them based on their work for which they have intellectual property rights. Thank you. Now we'll give the floor to Mr. Douzinas. I will be very brief. I will start with your question about vulnerability. I will give you an example from the discussion we had about the amendment to the Constitution. One of the main things I mentioned, and as opposed to New Democracy, when it comes to social rights, New Democracy did not introduce any new elements with the exception of a right to a minimum guaranteed income. We opposed their proposal, and because there is an international discussion about the minimum guaranteed income, and what we proposed and was passed was to guarantee a minimum dignified standard of living. Exactly because of what you said. This minimum standard of living is important, and this has been upheld by a court in Germany. So it is important to measure things and identify a minimum standard of living. And the minimum standard of living is not just determined by the minimum income that you can spend on education, etc., but it also includes the benefits of the social state, of the welfare state, and how the state can cover these needs through public healthcare, public education, and other aspects. So the state guarantees that you have this rounded protection, and it's like you said. And for me, this is a big discussion. The main problem of the left today is not the right-wing ideology. I see that Argyros is here from Cyprus. We do not have leadership of the right-wing ideology, but we have a capitalism dominance. And this is also part of the left. So any measures that can help us through social policy rebuild communities and establish a relationship with other people instead of seeing ourselves as individuals and having money to spend on specific things. All this will help us. I agree with you. There are many kinds of social policies, and we can take examples from other states like the US. In some states, there are such examples. They are trying to rebuild the concept of the community. We cannot leave the community to the hands of the nationalists, of the far right, etc. Now, regarding the Senate, you mentioned, and Olga also raised some objections about this. I never argued that this should happen. I just said that this is a discussion that we must have within the left. And we haven't talked about this. Let me reiterate what I said before. We were the first to introduce this issue of changing Europe many years ago. I was not here, but I used to read the documents about changing Europe and all this new direction. But right now what we do is that we limit ourselves to making a shopping list, a list of a few isolated approaches. And Olga said that this is a fixed dialogue. Yes, it might be. We had a big consultation about the amendment to the Constitution, and there was a committee. Mr. Skourandalakis said that this dialogue, this debate was fixed, it was anti-constitutional, it shouldn't have taken place. However, no concrete conclusion was reached. We had 60 sessions with chambers, associations, members of the civil society, citizens. And all this was important because people were informed of the fact that there is a constitution, that the left wants to amend the constitution, there are some issues raised, and there was a debate. Now let's talk about Europe. We say that the dialogue was fixed, and this means that there are fixed, predetermined questions, and there are people expressing specific views, like the views of Mr. Macron, for example. I don't know what you meant. The comment is off microphone. Okay. This is how politics works. You know very well, and I've experienced this, that we are in government but not in power. We went to participate in the elections, and what we want to do is to change power gradually, to change the power. And this is what the left argues, to the extent that we have accepted the parliamentary system. And we know how the situation is in Europe, and we know what Anastasia here mentioned about what happened in France. I know what Thatcher did, what Cameron did, and how Britain was destroyed. We know all that. So here in Greece, through constitutional amendment, we are starting a gradual process. You cannot announce from one day to the other that we are a socialist country and we have a socialist constitution, whatever that means. I don't know what it means. Why can't we do this in Europe? Not because we're going to win, but right now, when it comes to social policies, economic policies, environment protection, we will lose ground. And when you have the opportunity to speak to people, and, well, here there's an issue about whether it is dangerous or risky to enter into this discussion. And we have talked a lot about referendums. And people ask whether we want to introduce referendums in the by popular initiative within the Constitution, despite the fact that we have the Prespas Agreement, and maybe the people could object to the Prespas Agreement. Well, this is a general issue, and this is a general problem of the left theory. I have solved this problem because I trust the people. There is no way to exclude the possibility of people to express themselves. I don't care if I lose. I will allow them to express themselves. Well, of course, Germany will not accept many of our proposals. We know that, because this will mean increased taxation, a new budget, investments for unemployment, inequality, research, university, social security. So it will not happen. But why shouldn't I try? If I do not enter, if I'm not involved in the discussion, knowing what Olga said and knowing the problems of Europe after Maastricht, we all know the problems. However, since we are inside, it would be wrong to leave. Since we are inside and we remain inside, we must try, like we do in Greece, we must try to make some strategic improvements and changes. Of course, we cannot bring about socialism, and if France and Germany don't change internally through their political processes, well, what we can do are two things. First of all, defend ourselves, create a coalition with Social Democrats, the Greens, in order to defend ourselves against the right. And this is the difference between the leftists and the Social Democrats. Social Democrats believe that this is a good society. For me, this is not the case. So, whatever we do, no measure that we take is our final destination. We have a future goal and we take steps. For example, when it comes to labor rights, when we pass a law and the law comes into effect, we go to the next one. And this is for us the realization of socialism. There is a horizon of democracy that is far away. It gives us, sets the direction, and we move towards that direction. And given that today it is impossible to change these policies, we could at least speak to the people and tell them something different, completely different than what the right says, or the right-wing social democracy. And if the Piketty proposal is good, I have no problem in adopting it, or a proposal by Macron if the proposal is good. I do not believe that it will bring about significant changes, but on the other hand, I do not believe that it's correct when other people create this opportunity with their own interests to be left outside. We should participate in this and try to change things. And this happened to us in 2015. We played and we lost. Well, one may say that my only goal is to write books, but there are many things that one can do in order to change the situation. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all of you. Thank you. I would like to thank Mrs. Kouneva, Mr. Douzinas. The next panel is at 6:30. We have international speakers, so we will have a short break. And please come back to continue with our discussion. Thank you.
Γεια σας και μεγάλη επιτυχία. Καλή επιτυχία. Ευχαριστώ.